I learned that some people don't steal your land because they need it. They steal it because they think you'll never fight back. And my neighbor found that out the hard way the morning a concrete saw screamed across his brand new driveway. If you had driven through our little neighborhood a year ago, you would have thought nothing interesting ever happened there. Just trimmed lawns, pickup trucks, kids riding bikes after school, and retirees waving from front porches. But behind those quiet streets, people kept score over the smallest things, whose grass looked greener, whose mailbox stood straighter, whose property line was really where the old fence said it was. My name is Ethan Carter. I'm 48 years old, and I've lived in the same house outside Franklin, Tennessee, for almost 15 years. I don't chase drama. I don't enjoy arguments, and my wife used to joke that if someone stole my lawn chair, I'd probably apologize for making them carry it. That was true until my new neighbor, Brandon Cole, moved in next door. At first, Brandon seemed like the kind of guy everyone likes. He shook hands too hard, smiled too wide, and somehow managed to tell you how successful he was before you'd even learned his dog's name. The first weekend after he moved in, he rented a huge trailer, unloaded expensive tools, and told everyone on the street he planned to make his place the nicest property around. Nobody minded. In fact, most of us thought improvements would help the neighborhood. A couple months later, I woke up to the sound of heavy equipment outside my bedroom window. Cement trucks rolled in before 8. Workers spread gravel. Forms went up, and by lunch there was fresh concrete being poured at the edge of Brandon's driveway. I stood there holding a coffee mug, watching from my porch, figuring it was none of my business until something caught my eye. The forms looked strange. They didn't seem to stop where I always believed the property line was. I walked closer, staying on my side, and one of the workers nodded politely while smoothing wet concrete with a long finishing tool. I asked him, "You sure that's where the line is?" He shrugged and said, "We're pouring what the homeowner marked." I looked at Brandon, who stood with his hands on his hips wearing sunglasses like he was directing a movie set, and he waved at me with that same confident grin. I almost walked over then, but I told myself to wait. Maybe I was mistaken. Maybe old driveways always looked different when new concrete was added. 2 days later, the slab had cured, the forms came off, and my uneasy feeling turned into certainty. The edge of his new driveway wasn't beside mine anymore, it was sitting on mine. It didn't take a surveyor to notice that my tires now had less room than they'd had the week before. I grabbed a tape measure from my garage, checked from the old utility marker I'd always used as a reference, and frowned. I wasn't ready to accuse anyone over a few inches. So I did what reasonable adults are supposed to do. I walked to Brandon's front door and knocked. He answered wearing work boots and carrying a soda. I pointed toward the driveway and said, "Hey, I think the new concrete crossed over onto my side a little. Can we take a look together?" He glanced past me for maybe 2 seconds, took another sip, and said, "Looks fine to me." I smiled awkwardly and replied, "I'm serious. I think we should measure it." He shrugged. "Then measure it. If it's over the line, will you fix it?" I asked. His smile disappeared just enough for me to notice. "That's assuming you're right." Then, before I could answer, he pulled the door shut. I stood there staring at the wood grain, hearing the deadbolt click, wondering if I'd somehow become the unreasonable one. For the next couple of weeks, I tried to ignore it, but the situation didn't stay frozen in concrete. It grew. Brandon installed a portable basketball hoop exactly along that strip, except it wasn't really portable anymore because he anchored the base with extra supports. Then his teenage son started parking an old pickup partly across the same area, making it harder for me to back out without cutting sharply toward the street. One evening while I maneuvered around the truck, Brandon leaned against his garage and laughed. "You drive that thing like it's a battleship." I laughed too because that's what polite neighbors do, but inside I felt something changing. It wasn't about 16 inches of concrete anymore. It was about someone testing how much disrespect another person would tolerate. My wife told me to let it go. My brother told me to hire a lawyer. The retired couple across the street told me these disputes always get ugly. I spent a sleepless night sitting on my porch, looking at that strip of concrete under the porch light, and realized the worst thing wasn't losing a piece of driveway. The worst thing was knowing that every morning I'd see it and remember that I'd backed down. The next afternoon, I tried one last conversation. I walked over while Brandon washed his truck and calmly said, let's settle this before it gets bigger than it needs to be. He didn't even turn off the hose. Water splashed across the pavement as he smirked and said, "Then prove it's yours." Those 4 words echoed in my head all the way back to my garage, and by the time I sat down at my workbench, I wasn't angry anymore. I had become something far more dangerous to a man who relied on confidence alone. I had become patient. Patience has a funny way of looking like surrender to the person standing across from you. And for the next few days, Brandon seemed to believe he had already won. He waved when I pulled into my driveway, left his truck sitting half across the disputed strip for hours at a time, and even joked with another neighbor that maybe he should start charging me rent for using his side. I heard it through my open garage door, and instead of walking over, I opened my laptop. The first phone call I made wasn't to an attorney. It was to a licensed surveyor named Michael Jensen, a man who sounded bored by conflict because he had spent 30 years measuring where other people's arguments actually began. He asked for my address, looked up the parcel information, and said, "I'll be there Thursday morning. Don't move anything." Thursday arrived with gray skies and a light breeze, and Michael stepped out carrying equipment that looked more suited for a NASA mission than a suburban driveway. Brandon noticed almost immediately. He walked outside, pretending to check his mailbox, then stood with his arms folded, watching every move. Michael ignored him completely. He found old reference monuments buried under grass, compared them to county records, took measurements from multiple angles, and scribbled numbers onto a clipboard while I stood nearby, trying not to ask questions every 30 seconds. After nearly 2 hours, he looked at me and said quietly, "You're right. Actually, you're more right than you realize." We walked the property together, and he explained that Brandon's concrete didn't just drift over the line by roughly 16 inches across a stretch of more than 20 feet. It also occupied land that fell within a recorded drainage easement. I had heard the term before, but never paid attention to it. Michael knelt down and drew a rough sketch in the dirt with a stick. "Think of this area like a protected corridor," he explained. "Permanent structures here create problems because the city needs this space for drainage access. Your neighbor's contractor should have known that." I stared at the drawing. "So he crossed my property line and violated an easement?" Michael nodded. "Assuming these county records match what I'm seeing, yes." Then he smiled just a little and added, "Sometimes the tape measure tells the smallest part of the story." 3 days later, his official report arrived. I read every page twice. There were maps, coordinates, diagrams, photographs, and language so precise that even I could understand the conclusion. The encroachment existed. The measurements were documented. The boundaries were verified. The report cost me $460, and it felt like the best money I'd ever spent. My wife looked over my shoulder and asked, "So what now?" I answered, "Now we give him a chance to do the right thing." She raised an eyebrow because after everything that had happened, she knew I didn't actually expect that. Still, I wrote a respectful letter, attached copies of the survey, and mailed it certified so there could never be any argument about whether he received it. The letter explained the findings, requested removal of the encroachment within 30 days, and stated that I hoped we could resolve the matter without involving the city or the courts. I even wished him well at the end. For 4 days, there was silence. Then my phone buzzed while I was standing in line at a hardware store. It was a text from Brandon. 3 words. "Not gonna happen. No explanation. No discussion. No controfer." Just 3 words followed by a thumbs-up emoji that somehow made it even more insulting. I stared at the screen, laughed once, and saved a screenshot. The cashier asked if I needed a bag for my purchase. I looked up and said, "And maybe a bigger folder." She had no idea what I meant, but I did. From that moment forward, everything became evidence. I photographed the driveway every morning and every evening. I printed the text message. I requested copies of publicly available permit records from the city. I compared dates. I highlighted sections. I bought a 3-ring binder and organized everything with colored tabs like I was preparing for the world's least exciting school project. My brother came over one Saturday and looked at the growing stack of papers. He laughed and asked, "You planning to build a case or a library?" I answered, "Whichever one ends this." He slapped my shoulder and said, "I almost feel sorry for the guy." "Don't," I replied. He had every chance. The permit documents created an entirely new picture. The approved drawings didn't match what had actually been poured. Somewhere between paperwork and concrete, the dimensions had changed, and nobody had bothered to correct them. I wasn't looking for extra trouble for Brandon or his contractor, but facts don't care what you're looking for. They simply exist. After speaking with someone in the building department, I learned that a formal complaint could trigger an inspection. I hesitated for almost an hour before submitting it, because there's a line you cross when you involve government offices, and once you step over it, nobody gets to pretend the disagreement is just a misunderstanding anymore. Still, I filed a complaint. Then I contacted an attorney about filing an action to formally establish and protect the property boundary if necessary. He reviewed my documents, flipped through the survey, and looked at me over his glasses. "You came prepared." I smiled. "I had time." He nodded slowly. "Most people come in here with stories. You came with records." About 2 weeks later, a city inspector arrived. Brandon was outside washing his SUV when a white municipal truck pulled up. At first, he looked curious. Then he noticed the inspector carrying a clipboard toward the driveway. I watched discreetly from my porch while the two of them spoke. Brandon's confident posture slowly changed. His hands moved more. He pointed toward my house several times. The inspector remained calm, measured, wrote notes, and finally attached a notice to Brandon's front door before driving away. About 15 minutes later, my phone rang from an unfamiliar number. "Mr. Carter?" a voice asked. "Yes. This is Daniel with Summit Concrete. We handle some work next door. We'd like to discuss a possible resolution." I leaned back in my chair. "What kind of resolution?" There was a pause. Perhaps both parties could share the cost of modifying the slab. I almost admired the attempt. "Which part of the survey says this is my responsibility?" Silence. "Mr. Carter," he finally replied, "we're just trying to avoid unnecessary expense." "So am I." I answered. "That's why I asked him to fix it a month ago." He thanked me for my time and hung up. The following morning, before I had finished pouring my coffee, Brandon himself walked across the yard. For the first time since moving in, he didn't wear sunglasses. He didn't smile either. He stopped a few feet away and cleared his throat. "Look," he said, "this thing's gotten bigger than it needed to be." I folded my arms. "I agree. Maybe we split the removal costs and move on." I shook my head. "No." He frowned. "Come on, be reasonable." I looked directly at him and repeated the same lesson he had unknowingly taught me weeks earlier. Reasonable was when I knocked on your door the first time. His jaw tightened. "You're really going to make me pay for all of it?" "No." Yen swearat quietly. "You already made that decision when you told me to prove it." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Cars passed at the end of the street. Somewhere a lawnmower started. Finally, Brandon looked down at the concrete, then back at me. The confidence that had carried him through every conversation until now seemed to drain away because he finally understood something simple but expensive. He had mistaken silence for weakness and paperwork for bluffing. He turned around without another word and walked back across the very strip of driveway that had started the entire fight, leaving me standing there with my coffee growing cold and a strange feeling that the loudest victories are often the ones where nobody raises their voice at all. The crew showed up on a Thursday, just after sunrise, and I knew exactly why they had come the moment I heard the trailer rattle into the neighborhood. There wasn't any music playing, no joking around like the day Brandon's driveway had first been poured. The workers unloaded a concrete saw, safety barriers, and a vacuum system, moving with the quiet efficiency of people hired to undo an expensive mistake. I stood on my porch with a mug of coffee that had already gone cold, and for a second I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Brandon stepped outside wearing the same work boots I'd seen months earlier, but the swagger was gone. He looked tired, like someone who had spent several nights doing math he wished he never had to do. The foreman walked over to him, unfolded the survey map, and pointed to a bright red line. Brandon nodded once without arguing. That was the moment I realized the fight had actually ended days before. Today was just the receipt. When the saw started, the sound echoed across the neighborhood like a warning nobody could ignore. Curtains moved. Garage doors opened. People who had somehow never noticed the dispute suddenly found reasons to check their mailboxes or water their flowers. The machine followed the exact boundary established by the survey, inch by inch, carving a perfectly straight line through concrete that had once represented pride and certainty. Dust rose into the morning air, while pieces of the encroaching slab were broken apart and loaded into the trailer. One of the older neighbors, Mrs. Wallace, walked over to me and whispered, "I guess they finally figured out where the property line is." I smiled and answered, "Turns out the county already knew." She laughed so hard she nearly spilled the cup she was carrying. Around noon, Brandon crossed the yard toward me again. This time there was no negotiation left. "They're going to reseal your side after they're done," he said quietly. "Good," I replied. He shifted his weight and looked down at the ground. I should have handled this differently. I could have enjoyed the moment, thrown his own words back at him, reminded him about the slammed door or the text message or the jokes he'd made in front of other neighbors. But strangely enough, I didn't feel angry anymore. Winning through revenge would have lasted a day. Winning through accountability would last every time he looked at that driveway. So I simply said, "You had plenty of chances." He nodded once and walked away. By late afternoon, the damaged edge had been cut back, cleaned, repaired, and professionally sealed. If someone drove past a week later, they probably wouldn't notice anything unusual. They'd see two neighboring driveways separated by a clean line and assume it had always been that way. But I'd know the story hidden beneath that fresh sealant. I'd remember every conversation, every dismissive laugh, every document filed, every photograph taken, and every moment when doing nothing would have been easier than doing the right thing. The funny part is that the dispute changed more than a driveway. Brandon stopped parking across my side altogether. He measured before making improvements around his property. When contractors visited, I even overheard him say, "Let's verify the boundary first." Those words almost made me laugh because months earlier he had challenged me to prove it, and now he wanted proof before anyone poured a single bag of concrete. My wife asked one evening whether all the stress had been worth it for 16 inches of land. I looked out the window at the clean edge between our properties and told her it was never about 16 inches. She smiled because she already knew what I meant. Boundaries are strange things. They're not important because of the space they occupy. They're important because of the respect they represent. Once someone decides your boundaries don't matter, they'll keep pushing until they finally meet one that refuses to move. Mine happened to be drawn with survey stakes, paperwork, and a concrete saw. Looking back, I don't celebrate that my neighbor lost money or had to tear out work he'd proudly paid for. I celebrate that facts still matter, records still matter, and quiet persistence can beat loud confidence. Some people believe the strongest person in an argument is the one who shouts the longest. My experience taught me it's usually the one who keeps collecting evidence while everyone else is talking. And maybe that's why this story still gets brought up at neighborhood barbecues whenever someone starts discussing fences, trees, or property lines. Someone always points toward those two driveways and says, "Measure twice." Then somebody else answers, "Or pay once." I never add anything after that because the driveway tells the story better than I can. But now I'm curious about your opinion. If your neighbor slowly took part of your property and laughed when you asked them to fix it, would you have handled it the same way, or would you have chosen a different path? Was Brandon simply stubborn, or did I take the legal fight too far? Share your thoughts and your own experiences in the comments, because some of the most unbelievable neighborhood stories come from real life. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for the next story, where an ordinary disagreement turns into something nobody on the block ever expected.